Escalada. El día de mañana, el presidente estadounidense.
Tomorrow, US President Donald Trump and Ukraine's outgoing President Volodymyr Zelensky will hold a long-awaited, or rather, highly anticipated, meeting in the US capital, Washington. In this meeting, Trump will finally decide whether to send Ukraine Tomahawk missiles with nuclear capability and sufficient range to carry out a deep strike against Russia, including its capital, Moscow. The possible response to a Tomahawk missile attack from Ukraine could quite simply trigger World War III.
Desencadenar la Tercera Guerra Mundial. Podríamos entonces estar presenciando.
Could we then be witnessing the beginning, the trigger of a direct war between the United States and Russia? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Buenos Aires, Argentina. We begin transmission number 273 of Demolishing Myths Live. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to support us by subscribing, giving a thumbs up, leaving comments, joining through PayPal memberships, and of course, following us on our social networks, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, as well as on our associated pages, or rather, our partner channels, DMP Geopolitics, and our English language channel, Demolishing Political Nets.
El día de mañana, en efecto,
Tomorrow, in fact, we are going to witness a crucial, extremely important meeting, because President Trump, the US President, will have his first meeting with President Zelensky since September, when both took part in an event in New York during the United Nations General Assembly. On that occasion, Zelensky explicitly made a request regarding the delivery of Tomahawk missiles.
A la entrega de misiles Tomahawk. Trump hasta el momento coqueteó con la idea.
So far, Trump has flirted with the idea, made statements, but has not defined his position, at least not publicly. Tomorrow, he will indeed announce his final answer to this issue. The truth is that beyond the possible response, whether yes, no, or some intermediate formula like yes but or no but, we are going to immediately present all possible scenarios, including Russia's potential responses, in just a moment. But beyond whatever answer Trump gives, this flirtation with Tomahawk missiles comes in the context of an open escalation by the Trump administration regarding the war in Ukraine. Let's remember that when he came to power for his current term, the second presidential term of Donald Trump, his campaign was characterized by an anti-war message and the promise to end the war with Ukraine in 24 hours. Well, gradually, President Trump abandoned that supposedly negotiation-oriented conciliatory stance, while at the same time the United States was carrying out a strategic withdrawal from the war in Ukraine. So, how can Trump now present a more warlike position regarding Ukraine and, indirectly, Russia, while simultaneously retreating tactically in this conflict?
Y a la vez retroceder tácticamente en este conflicto? Bueno, de la siguiente manera. Por un lado,
well, here's how it goes. On one hand, Trump is creating pressure for the continuation of the war. The possible delivery of Tomahawks is precisely about that, generating more pressure to keep the war going, but above all, to ensure the continued European support for Ukraine, and naturally also the continued participation of Ukrainians in this war as a proxy army, as cannon fodder serving the United States. On one hand, but at the same time, President Trump also clearly presented his concept for the continuation of this war. The United States, under his administration, is gradually abandoning the leadership of that military effort in terms of day-to-day management, and instead delegating that leadership to Europe, while selling weapons so that Europe and NATO can later send them to Ukraine.
Despachen posteriormente a Ucrania. Y no solamente armas, sino también la
And not only weapons, but also the indispensable intelligence from US satellites. This is the maneuver. This is Trump's strategy. On one hand, the increasingly clear decision to continue the war and the US sponsorship of that continuity, which at some point was in doubt, at least among the more naive analysts, because of that promise from Trump. Trump wants the continuation of the war. He wants the continuation of the confrontation with Russia in order to bring about a strategic Russian defeat. But at the same time, and in fact, he has already begun, he wants to abandon the leadership of that war and to dispatch weapons, or rather, to commercialize them, to carry out the sale of weapons, so that later, Europe, in charge of purchasing and delivering those weapons, can take command of the war effort in Ukraine, can take command of the war project in Ukraine. Trump made this very clear at the time, with that statement. From now on, we sell weapons to NATO, and NATO does whatever it wants with them. The subtext of this is quite clear. We take part in the war through arms sales, but without direct command, at least not on a day-to-day basis. This is the context of the escalation, generally speaking, confirmed in multiple reports, such as this one, right here. A report from none other than the Financial Times, a British publication with many intelligence sources, which confirms the involvement of the United States in the attacks carried out by Ukraine in recent weeks against Russia's energy facilities. Here, according to this report, citing secret Pentagon sources, it is laid out in black and white. The participation of the Americans, both in providing intelligence and even in planning these attacks. The headline, Ukraine attacks Russian energy facilities with US help. The Trump administration supported Kyiv's operations from the start. Some excerpts from what was published here. US intelligence shared with Kyiv has enabled strikes on key Russian energy assets, including oil refineries far beyond the front line, according to several Ukrainian and American officials. This support, which had not been previously reported, has intensified since mid-summer, the Northern Hemisphere's summer, and has been crucial for Ukraine to carry out attacks that Joe Biden's White House had discouraged. Kyiv's strikes have driven up energy prices in Russia and forced Moscow to cut diesel exports and fuel imports. This is one of many reports, in this case from the Financial Times, that confirm this decision by the United States to continue the war. This decision by President Donald Trump to maintain the continuity of the conflict, although now from this new role, yes, as a supplier of war, a supplier of intelligence and a supplier of weapons. But specifically, we are witnessing this flirtation with the Tomahawks, once again, in a general context of escalation. Here we have another interesting report, also from the Financial Times, once again. If the platform helps me, there we go. On the same issue, but in this case about the Tomahawk missiles. The Tomahawk missiles that Trump is considering for Ukraine. The President of the United States has suggested selling Kyiv a long-range weapon capable of striking Moscow. The President of the United States is expected to discuss possible deliveries and how Ukraine would use the weapon with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, at the White House on Friday. The Tomahawk is an incredible weapon, a very offensive weapon, Trump said on Monday, and frankly, Russia doesn't need it. This is the context, once again, of this flirtation, of the escalation. Within this framework of strategic withdrawal, I keep emphasizing this. I'm presenting this idea once again, because before getting into the specific analysis, I want us to remember this. If the United States, in a new role, wants the continuation of the war, it wants Russia's strategic defeat, but with Europe in charge of both the coordination and the day-to-day management of the war, and naturally, of the costs. Therefore, the profits from this war are, above all, for the American military-industrial complex, and for the weapons sold, not given away, as was the case before under Joe Biden, Donald Trump's predecessor. Now then, what are Trump's concrete statements regarding this? What is his position so far? Well, these are the exact words Trump has said up to this point, when asked about this the day before yesterday. These are his exact words. Afterward, we will present today's statements and the conversation held with Zelensky before his arrival. Attention. The question, Tomahawks for Ukraine, and Trump replies. Let's talk about that. President Zelensky will come to the United States on Friday, and I know what he's going to say, that he'll want more weapons, that he'll want Tomahawks.
Do you need any Tomahawks in Argentina?
Los Tomahawks son muy buenos, justo en ese encuentro.
Tomahawks. The Tomahawks are very good. Right at that meeting, Millie was sitting in front. Hence the joke. Millet, do you in Argentina want some Tomahawks? We're going to deliberate on the delivery of the Tomahawks. He wants them. These are his words from yesterday and today, the ones from right now, from here, when asked about the topics of conversation with Zelensky. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the war, we're going to talk about weapons, and this statement is crucial. Pay attention. They want to go on the offensive. They want to go on the offensive in the sense that they want attacks. The Ukrainians don't just want a defensive role, but also an offensive one in the war. I'm going to make a determination in that regard. I'm going to state my position on that. But you know, they want to go on the offensive, and I have to make a decision. Well, once again, Trump with this flirting between yes and no. The Ukrainians want it. They want more weapons. They want Tomahawks. Everyone wants Tomahawks. Joking with Millie. You don't want Tomahawks? Or maybe he does more than you. Never addressing Millie formally, right? Quite the opposite, actually. But this is his response. I have to make a decision. They want to go to the... On the other hand, just a few minutes ago, another statement from Trump. This one here, 1 second. Once again, regarding that same statement. The same issue. The audio is bad. I don't want the translation of this. But when asked about the matter, he basically replied that, in a phone conversation held just minutes ago today, before Zelensky's arrival, we've made a lot of progress. Interestingly, today we've made a lot of progress regarding the future. We've achieved a lot of progress today. Once again, Trump being critical. Trump without... Well, the moment didn't clearly appear, but the video... Anyway, those were Trump's statements just a moment ago. What's the context in the United States?
¿Cuál el contexto en Estados Unidos? Bueno, por sobre todas las cosas...
Well, above all else, among the Democrats, in media outlets close to the Democratic Party, but also even among the Republican neoconservative hawks, voices are multiplying, demanding the delivery of these systems. Everyone wants Trump to send these weapons systems to Ukraine. Here, for example, is the position of a general, yesterday on CNN, former General Chuck King, regarding the Tomahawks. A bit of the general context of public opinion and published opinion, above all, in the media, and the pressure on Trump over this issue.
That's what's at play here. And what
Attention.
we can do to emphasize again to our viewers.
Lo que está en juego aquí, según este general, lo que está en juego aquí...
What's at stake here, according to this general, is what Ukraine is going to do with these missiles. And I have to say it clearly, the Ukrainians are not going to attack civilian targets. They're not going to attack urban centers, like, for example, Moscow. There are people rubbing their hands together saying, they're going to attack Moscow, and this will cause the war to expand, an escalation of the war. This, in reality, is a military escalation like the one we carried out in the Middle East to end the war. The goal here is not to extend or escalate the war, but to end it. Well, this is the level of madness prevailing in published opinion in the United States, especially in media close to the Democrats. Presenting the delivery of intermediate-range cruise missiles, with a range of up to 2,500 kilometers, in the longer-range versions, admittedly older, while the current versions have a range of around 1,500 kilometers, once again with nuclear capability. Presenting this as a weapon capable of a direct nuclear strike on Moscow is, in this case, unlikely, but not impossible. And in fact, no one can determine the contents of a missile's warhead, whether it's a cruise missile like this one, or a ballistic missile, until the moment it explodes. Therefore, presenting the delivery of a weapons system of this nature as a move toward ending the war, rather than as an extremely dangerous escalatory move with a high likelihood of a Russian reaction far beyond anything seen so far. Well, presenting it that way reflects the level of madness and recklessness of these people. Because, by the way, in the event of a Russian response and a nuclear escalation, both the CNN journalists and this general would basically vanish from the face of the earth. But this essentially characterizes the current context in the United States. Simply put, here's an example of this pressure, of this demand for the delivery of these weapons, for the delivery of the Tomahawk missiles. And on the other hand, in Russia, we're witnessing the opposite situation, the demand for a response to a potential attack with these missiles, with much greater force, with much greater virulence than in the past. For example, a former US Army officer who became a deserter and has for some years now been serving in the Russian armed forces, a general known as Stanislav Krapivnik, gave the following response when asked by Russian media how Russia should react to an attack with Tomahawk missiles.
Un ataque con misiles Tomahawk. Y su respuesta la siguiente.
And his response was as follows. Any cruise missile can be equipped with a nuclear warhead. The type of warhead that actually arrives, high explosive, cluster, or nuclear, will only be determined after the explosion. They are not fast missiles. They don't have stealth systems, as they're called in English, stealth or invisibility systems, in quotes. Therefore, our air defense systems, the Russian ones, can easily shoot them down. But it's impossible to know exactly what is flying. At this moment, everything depends on our political military leadership. How will it react to the Tomahawks? Putin, precisely.
Ante los Tomahawks. Putin, precisamente. Hasta ahora estamos enviando mensajes demasiado.
So far, we've been sending messages to the West that are too weak and therefore ineffective. For example, statements like, they'll have problems if they supply Tomahawks to Ukraine, don't influence Western politicians. These are the words of former officer Stanislav Krapivnik. He concludes his statement as follows. It's necessary to declare that as soon as the first missile flies toward Moscow, Washington will cease to exist. Instead of a metropolis, we'll leave a large radioactive crater. And Europe can be promised an attack on the US nuclear weapons depots on its territory. Only there are such harsh statements understood, or only such harsh statements are understood there. If we keep silent, the Tomahawks will fly toward us, and if we don't start giving strong responses, it's very possible we'll face the first nuclear attack against Moscow. It can't be ruled out. After all, we've already seen how tough rhetoric affects the Europeans. As soon as we declared that, in response to the first Taurus missile attack, we would strike Germany's largest military equipment manufacturer, Rheinmetall, the missile talks stopped. The United States only backs down when it meets resistance. Those are the statements of a former general who served in the Soviet armed forces. Harsh ones, to say the least.
Fuerzas Armadas soviéticas duras por demás. Con lo cual, el contexto, una vez más.
Thus, in this context, once again, Trump flirts with the delivery of missiles within a framework of general escalation promoted by the United States, while strategically stepping back by delegating the conduct of the war and its financing to Europe, yet generating pressure for an even greater escalation through this delivery of weapons, and logically, through the necessary provision of intelligence, and even the operation of these missiles. Because the Ukrainians could not operate these missiles, just as they could not and cannot operate the Storm Shadow missiles provided by the United Kingdom, or the Scalp missiles provided by France. They cannot launch these missiles without the participation of British and French military personnel, respectively. Remember, I'm not the one presenting it this way. Former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz himself explained it like this in an interview. Later, that led to a leak from British intelligence services against Scholz himself. But just as those missiles depend on British and French operation, the Americans will not only provide the necessary intelligence for the operation of these missiles, but will also carry out the operation of the missiles themselves, the red button in the hands of a US soldier. Meanwhile, on both sides, public opinion, both in the United States and in Russia, and the media keep hammering away at the need, on the US side, to deliver these missiles, and on the Russian side to respond with escalation, even a nuclear response.
Incluso de una respuesta nuclear. Esta es la situación. Presentemos ahora.
This is the current situation. Now let's present the words of the Russian and Belarusian political leaders themselves about this escalation. Let's start with Lukashenko, and then move on to Putin. Here's Lukashenko. There have been many signs of escalation from the United States. We're hearing talk about Tomahawk missiles, and these weapons can have a very long range. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, responds, No, we need to calm down. I think we need to calm down. Regarding this whole matter, I've already said, perhaps even to you yourself, this Russian reporter, that our friend Donald, referring of course to Donald Trump, has a special tactic for applying pressure on most issues.
Para presionar en la mayoría de los temas. Inicialmente, pero después.
Initially, but then, a little bit back. I didn't get that part. How unclear the translation is, 1 second. He has a tactic to apply pressure in the most aggressive way at the beginning, and then he delegates it to the appropriate authorities. That's why, at first, he acts very violently, very effusively, but then he lets things de-escalate and moves on to another topic. That's why we shouldn't take this completely seriously. We need to calm down. Well, those were Lukashenko's words. However, Putin himself responded in an interview, diplomatically, yes, but also clearly, that the delivery of Tomahawk missiles would mean the end of the rapprochement between the United States and Russia, initiated by the Trump administration. His spokesperson Peskov responded in much harsher terms. An attack of this nature would trigger a corresponding response toward the suppliers of those weapons. And if we want, here's a little gem from the past. Putin's position before the war began in its open phase in 2022, or at least the war in its open phase with Russia's direct participation on the battlefield since February 2022. Here's Putin's stance 4 years ago, when he shouldn't, in a way, have undermined his own positions in the midst of a conflict and the possibility of escalation. Logically, in this situation, like any prudent leader, Putin cannot publicly cannot make a public statement about the ideas he has in his head, because that could trigger an escalation, like the one Trump constantly provokes by blurting out whatever comes to mind and setting off unpredictable effects, often against the United States itself, in Trump's case. But here is Putin's true position from 4 years ago, broadcast on Russian television.
Estas sus palabras.
These were his words back then. Attention. Despite our warnings, despite our conversations and requests, the infrastructure has moved closer. The missile infrastructure has moved closer to our borders. It has reached the point where there are now anti-missile defense systems deployed in Poland and Romania, and Mk-41 launchers. Those Mk-41 launchers can be equipped with Tomahawk missiles attack systems. This poses a threat to us. It's an evident fact, something obvious. Despite all our pleas and requests not to do it, what has happened? What we see now, in response, is that we have been forced, I want to emphasize this, forced to start developing hypersonic weapons. This is our response. Of course, the hypersonic weapons in question, at that time unknown to the general public, are naturally the Kinzhal missiles, also the Oryeshnik missiles, and of course any other weapon developed by Russia that has not yet been made public, but has already been announced by Putin on more than one occasion. The existence of more hypersonic weapons. A bit more about Putin's response 4 years ago regarding the possibility of Tomahawks on the border. From Russia, and even more so in Ukraine. You ask me about Ukraine. Where are the red lines? It's mainly about the creation of threats to us that could come from that territory. If this infrastructure keeps expanding, I've already said this publicly, you are practical people, and maybe haven't had time to follow this, but I'll repeat it once more. If some strike systems appear on Ukrainian territory, the flight time to Moscow will be 7 to 10 minutes, and in the case of deploying hypersonic weapons, 5 minutes. Imagine that, the flight time to Moscow will be 5 minutes. And what are we supposed to do? Then, we will have to create something similar in relation to those who threaten us in this way. Can you imagine it? And we can do it now, because we have successfully tested it. And starting early next year, we will have a new, sea-based hypersonic missile in service at Mach 9. The flight time to those who give the orders will also be 5 minutes. Where are we headed? Why are we doing all this? The creation of such threats against us is the red line. Putin's words are clear. Now this was 4 years ago. What was the response at the time? If they develop those weapons, we will develop equivalent or better ones.
Nosotros vamos a generar armas equivalentes o mejores, y Rusia efectivamente generó armas.
And Russia indeed developed weapons not only equivalent but superior. The United States and the West, NATO, lack a hypersonic missile. European countries also lack hypersonic weapons. Russia, on the other hand, possesses a vast arsenal of hypersonic missiles, including avant-garde intercontinental hypersonic ballistic missiles, along with the Zircon, the Kinzhal, and so on. But Putin was responding to this in a context of threats, in a context of missile deployments in Poland, in Romania, and eventually in Ukraine, without their use. Now we are beginning, in 2022, a completely different phase, distinct from the confrontation between NATO and Russia, because we are witnessing a war through Ukraine between both blocs. Therefore, in this case, if Putin maintains his stance from 4 years ago, not only will Russia respond by creating these weapons, Chakriadas by the way, but in the event of an attack against Russia, it will respond with an attack against the sponsors of that attack. In the case of an attack from Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, Russia could indeed respond with missiles aimed, at the very least, at US bases in Europe, such as the Tomahawk missile bases or the Aegis system bases located in Poland and Germany. In Romania, supposedly defensive systems that can actually be easily converted into offensive ones. Those were Putin's words 4 years ago. Quite interesting, isn't it? The current response is much more diplomatic, given the context of a war, but his real position was the one from 4 years ago. Now then, let's begin analyzing the possible scenarios. First, what characteristics do these Tomahawk missiles have? Well, first of all, let's remember, they are Tomahawk missiles.
En primer lugar, recordemos, representan misiles anticuados, desarrollados inicialmente.
Outdated, originally developed in the early 1980s, naturally improved later, but still based on the same original technology. These missiles have subsonic speeds, below the speed of sound, around 800 kilometers per hour, basically the speed of a commercial airplane, more or less. They lack deterrence systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and stealth features against radar. In that sense, they are relatively visible to Russian interception systems. On the other hand, they offer great accuracy thanks to several positioning systems, some connected to external sources, such as GPS or satellite systems, and also internal geolocation systems, with preloaded maps stored in the missile's memory, compared in real time with video footage captured by the missile itself. In this way, even without a GPS connection, even if geolocation is lost, the missile can generate internal guidance by comparing its own maps with the images captured by its camera. So in that sense, it's a very precise missile. Once again, an outdated missile, a slow missile, an interceptable missile, easily interceptable, but at the same time, very precise, and above all, with great range and nuclear capability.
Gran alcance y con capacidad nuclear, con lo cual cualquier misil volando hacia Moscú,
which means that any missile flying toward Moscow could imply a nuclear threat against Moscow. Perhaps an unlikely threat, certainly. Trump would hardly endorse a nuclear attack on Moscow. But this is where speculation begins. How would Americans respond to a missile with nuclear capability flying toward New York or Washington? Would they deliberate over the slim chances, the low probability of a nuclear warhead? Or would they respond vehemently, precisely based on the worst possible scenario, the possibility of a nuclear warhead?
La posibilidad de una carga nuclear. Bueno, esa la cuestión. Misil.
Well, that's the point. A long-range nuclear missile. Everything else, its interceptability, its outdated nature, its development in the early 1980s, its lack of deterrence or electronic warfare mechanisms, its absence of stealth capabilities. Well, yes, all that may describe the missile technically, but specifically, it's a long-range missile with nuclear capability. That said, even in its most modern versions, this missile basically represents a missile designed to be launched from the water, both from submarines and from destroyers.
Submarinos como desde destructores. Y de hecho,
And in fact, the vast majority of the missiles used so far by the United States, Tomahawk missiles, a missile, by the way, widely used by that country in its many interventions, such as in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen, if I remember correctly. Well, in all those cases, the launches were carried out from the water, from destroyers or submarines. But for some years now, the Americans have wanted a land-based version of this missile, a version that can be launched from the ground.
Versión lanzable desde tierra. Y quizás por sobre todas las cosas debido a esta razón.
And perhaps, above all else, for this reason, the United States withdrew from the treaty known as the INF Treaty, short for Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the so-called Euromissiles. A treaty signed by Reagan and Gorbachev. At the moment, my memory fails me, and I can't recall whether it was in 83 or 87, but ultimately it doesn't matter. Sometime in the mid-80s. This treaty, at the time, established the prohibition of all land-based missiles, all ground-launched missiles of intermediate range. Maybe someone can help me with the exact date.
87, por ahí me ayudan con el dato concreto. Muchas gracias. De todos los misiles de rango.
Thank you very much. Of all the intermediate range missiles, or in other words, all land-based missiles with a range between 500 and 3,500 kilometers, both ballistic and cruise, that treaty established the prohibition of these missiles. Not only their development, but also their possession was banned. Once again, land-based, ballistic or cruise missiles of intermediate range within that distance. And that led to a major de-escalation during the Cold War and the elimination of a large arsenal of intermediate-range missiles, both in the United States and in Russia. This is the original treaty.
Rusia. El tratado original los llamaban misiles.
These intermediate-range missiles were called European missiles or Euromissiles because precisely due to their range, neither Russia could use them to carry out an attack against the United States, nor the United States against Russia, at least not against the main cities. Of course, Russia could have launched an attack from Kamchatka to Alaska, or the United States from Alaska to Kamchatka, but that did not pose a strategic threat to either of the great powers. At that time, the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, the United States and Russia, because the capitals and major cities of both countries were far beyond their reach. Both Washington, the capital, and Moscow, the capital, as well as St. Petersburg, New York, and Los Angeles, were well outside the range of these missiles.
Mucho más allá del rango de estos misiles. ¿Y dónde podían descender estos misiles?
And where could these missiles land? Or what was the planned target for missiles of this range? Basically, in Europe. Both the Soviets, and later the Russians, could carry out attacks across all of Europe with these missiles. And even the Americans, from that Europe, could launch attacks against Russia, but only from that Europe. Or possibly from the United States to the western coast of Europe, which was unlikely. Only in the scenario of a Europe invaded by Russia would they be relevant in that case. But once again, on the map with the United States on one side and Russia on the other, these missiles only had enough range for attacks on Europe. That's why this treaty to eliminate those missiles, both ballistic and cruise, whether nuclear or conventional, was so important. That's why it mattered so much to Europe. Extremely important. And that's why this agreement was so relevant in the de-escalation of the Cold War between Gorbachev and Reagan in 1987. Well, suddenly, during Donald Trump's first presidency, the United States decided to withdraw, to unilaterally leave this treaty. By the way, it's a treaty often taught in universities as a model of a successful treaty, an example of a successful agreement. Because it not only established mutual controls and oversight of development, but even led to the destruction of a tremendous arsenal, and therefore a much safer, more peaceful situation for the United States, for Russia, and above all, for Europe. Well, overnight, Trump decided to withdraw from this treaty. The announcement was made in 2018, and the withdrawal became effective a year later, as stipulated by the treaty. First the announcement, then the effective withdrawal 1 year afterward. In 2018, Trump made the surprise announcement, and in 2019 the United States definitively left the agreement. Why? And here we return once again to the issue of the Tomahawks. The US withdrew because it wanted to develop a land-based Tomahawk missile, one that could be launched from the ground. Tomahawk missiles have an intermediate range, which fell under the scope of this treaty. But since they were launched from the sea, from destroyers or submarines, they were exempt from this regulation. Because they wanted a land-based version, which was prohibited by the treaty, Trump decided to withdraw from it. And that's how, by the way, the development of ground-based launchers for these missiles began. And above all, the United States, or rather among all the competing projects at the time, began developing a launcher known as Typhoon in English or Typhon in Spanish, with the capability. Here we can show the Wikipedia page, nothing more, just that, the image of this missile, or rather, of this launcher. Here's the launcher. This is just the image of the launcher's transport truck, with vertical launch batteries for 4 missiles. These Typhoon launchers, which have become the quintessential launchers for intermediate-range land-based missiles in the United States, also include other components. Accompanying this launcher is a truck, at least one additional truck, for the guidance and operation of these missiles, as well as other supplementary elements. It's not just the launcher itself, but this one is basically one of the containers previously used on submarines or destroyers, placed in a mobile, land-based container. It's very similar to a commercial container. The launcher is installed with a hydraulic system and, logically, a vertical missile launcher with a truck in front. This is the US development. Also here, this smaller one. Well, here the multiple ones. This is interesting. This one a bit larger. It's appearing, yes. It's showing up. Well, there on the left is the launcher, and on the right are all the support trucks for the radars, satellites, guidance, and operation of these missiles. Also, of course, over there on the right, very small, there are some trucks for reloading with more missiles. This is the vertical launcher, and here are all the satellites and command systems for these missiles. In addition to the Tomahawk missiles, visible down here on the right, these launchers, once again with 4 missile batteries, can launch the missiles known as standard SM-6. Originally designed for defense, these are the well-known missiles of the Aegis system, a supposedly defensive system, partly deployed throughout Europe, but also in Spain, if I remember correctly, in Rota, and in Germany. US warships anchored in Rota are equipped with this type of missile. The standard SM-6, supposedly defensive but easily convertible into offensive missiles. This launcher can basically fire those missiles, defensive but clearly not, and the Tomahawk missiles. Well, the delivery of these... Well, sorry, I'll first present the technical characteristics, and then we can indeed describe the scenarios. This is one of the possible launch options. But of course, each of these systems is extremely valuable. The United States produced only a few. We just saw it. You may have been with me when I showed the images of the size of this equipment, the huge number of trucks, the gear, the high cost. And the United States, so far, has produced very few of these expensive and complex missile systems for once again, 4 Tomahawk missiles, which are already large missiles, weighing more than 1,500 kilos. So far, since they produced so few, the Americans were able to distribute some of these units among their own armed forces, and some to Japan, mainly as a threat to North Korea and China. Nothing more than that. The Germans want some of these. In fact, if I remember correctly, they've already started bidding processes for the purchase. But the Americans can't sell these missiles because of their scarcity. They can't ramp up production fast enough to meet the demand from many allied countries for these major weapons systems. Now then, in parallel, after the withdrawal from the INF Treaty by Trump's unilateral decision, the US Marines began, or at the request of the US Marines, the development began, of a much simpler, much smaller launch platform, with a single Tomahawk missile on the launcher. Which missile, or which launcher? This one here. Pay attention to the difference between this launcher and the previous one. This one here. This is the photo, if you can help me, on the website. Well, just now, if you help me, updating. This is a US Navy page. That's why it has restricted access and a security system that identifies the incoming IP address. That's why sometimes the browser doesn't allow entry, until finally it does. It was just online and now suddenly it's not. Well, just a second it'll show up. Patience, folks. Because here it is. It's actually showing up now. 1 second. It's loading here. There we go. Naval news. This is from the United States. The photo doesn't want to show up here.
Estados Unidos y no quiere aparecer la foto. Qué cosa. Crear imagen.
What a thing. Well, what bad luck. I wanted to show the image of this other launcher, much smaller, with a single Tomahawk missile. Well, while I go over what happened with this launcher from its development to its cancellation, I can somehow generate an image of it. For some reason, it doesn't want to load. This one here. Can we now? Can we or can't we? Well, maybe the image is a little small, but at least it's visible here. Here it's better. Now yes. Well, this is the launcher.
Ahora sí. Bueno, esta es la lanzadera. Atención a la diferencia de tamaño.
Pay attention to the size difference. Pay attention to the size difference between this small truck with a launcher and the huge container complex shown earlier. Well, this program to develop a land-based Tomahawk missile launcher was started by the Marines, but it was soon abandoned because, according to the bidding requirements for this system, it did not have the specific or required features for operating in swampy or muddy terrain. What was the Marines' basic idea for using this Tomahawk launcher?
De esta lanzadera de Tomahawks, que básicamente querían ellos en una operación anfibia.
Basically, what they wanted was, in an amphibious operation, to land on the coasts, for example of Venezuela, disembark with amphibious vehicles on those shores, and immediately, with these relatively small systems, much more mobile than the other behemoths shown earlier, establish defensive positions. The idea was that, from then on, those coasts territorially taken by the US amphibious forces, the Marines, would be protected against the possibility of enemy warships approaching. They set them up there to generate what they call in military terms securitization. That is, to somehow consolidate the capture of those coasts with these small launchers. Well, due to the failure to meet the requirements, last year, if I remember correctly, this program was abandoned, and the US government then decided to replace these systems with more modern ones, featuring different missiles and different launchers. Therefore, this single Tomahawk launcher project was abandoned. But the United States produced between a dozen and 2 dozen of these missiles, stored in a warehouse with little use or functionality, naturally awaiting a battlefield, a useful testing ground for them, in a situation different from the sandy or swampy terrains originally planned for these launchers. Unmet requirements, and therefore, the decision to cancel it.
Requerimientos no cumplidos y por ende la decisión de su cancelación. En Ucrania, estas lanzaderas recorrerían terrenos.
In Ukraine, these launchers would move across firmer terrain for most of the year, consolidated ground or asphalt, gravel or dirt roads, but solid ones, with the exception, of course, of the Rasputitsa season, with the mud typical of that time in Eastern Europe. Then, in that case, they could operate with a much greater concealment capacity than the large previous systems, and at a much lower cost, while still maintaining the ability to launch these intermediate-range missiles. Therefore, among the possible alternatives, sending the missiles, deciding not to send them, or rejecting the shipment, well, between yes and no, here we find a yes but.
El sí y el no, por acá aparece un sí pero. La posibilidad de un sí pero. Sí misiles Tomahawk.
The possibility of a yes but. Yes to the Tomahawk missiles, but in small numbers, on individual launchers, and territorially limited. That is one of the plausible options regarding the Tomahawks and Trump's decision tomorrow. We could also consider a possibility we might call no but. No Tomahawk missiles, but something else instead. And this is also one of the possibilities, one of the scenarios discussed just yesterday by one of the Ukrainian newspapers, the Kiev Post. Published in English, here is the Spanish translation. The no but alternative basically consists of flirting with the idea of delivering the Tomahawks if Germany first sends the famous Taurus missiles. Remember that for quite some time now, both the European Union, especially the United Kingdom and France, and the United States have been exerting pressure for the delivery of the Taurus missiles. The Russians responded clearly. In the event of an attack with Taurus missiles, we will respond with an attack on Berlin, basically. And Trump could flirt with this idea with a later objective, not the delivery itself, ultimately, of the Tomahawks, but rather to create pressure for the delivery of the German Taurus missiles. And this is the headline of this news. Pressuring Putin, pressuring the Allies, Trump links the Tomahawk deal to the transfer of German missiles. Pay attention to this, everyone. It's a bombshell. This outcome is also highly likely. Among the possible scenarios, then, regarding yes or no to the Tomahawks, The most probable ones are actually intermediate scenarios. Yes, but with the smaller launchers, or no, but instead of delivering the Tomahawks, delivering the Taurus. The President of the United States is nearing a decision on the Tomahawk missiles, a decision that, according to Kiev Post sources, is designed to pressure Moscow and dispel allies' doubts. Zelensky's visit will seal defense cooperation. And as for the Taurus, this tactic is strategically calculated not only to strengthen Ukraine's defense, but also to compel reluctant European allies, particularly Germany, regarding the Taurus missile, to follow suit, according to sources familiar with the matter, who spoke to the Kiev Post on Monday. This pressure is already generating a public diplomatic movement. German Chancellor Merz announced on Monday that he would speak with Trump about joint efforts to also help bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Well, remember that for them, these arms shipments, for the brainless European leaders, this openly escalatory arms delivery, and in the case of the Taurus missiles, with the effective promise that the Russians would respond directly against Germany, without a doubt, given the entire history between Russia and Germany. Well, for the idiot Merz, this would mean the end of the war. Or in other words, they could send the Taurus missiles supposedly to create pressure, and thus bring about the end of the war, when in reality, it will do exactly the opposite, an escalation. But this is Merz's vision, and those are Merz's statements from a few days ago. So be careful, because this is a possibility. Trump's threat is, we'll only send the Tomahawks if the German Taurus shipments to Ukraine start first. And then obviously, in the meantime, Trump will backtrack, and the Taurus missiles will only appear in the hands of the Ukrainians. Actually, not in the hands of the Ukrainians, because in this case, the Germans would also be operating the missiles. These missiles would only appear on Ukrainian territory, and they would appear. From there they would attack Russia, and Russia would respond directly over the heads of the Germans or anyone living in Germany, like me, although fortunately I'm currently visiting Buenos Aires, my home, my land. These are the scenarios. So, tomorrow the answer, yes or no, or maybe yes but, or no but. In short, no one can determine it with certainty for now. The most plausible scenarios are these. In the context of a general escalation, this would generate an even greater escalation, with heavy pressure from both sides to increase hostilities, especially in Russia. Yesterday, in the talk with Fernando, we were presenting precisely a counterpoint on this, even though it might seem otherwise. According to Fernando, Trump would determine what he supposedly plans to decide. While Trump could align with Fernando's position, no, he's not going to dismiss them in any way because of the risk. That's Fernando's stance. I'm a bit more skeptical on this point. After so many back and forths with the tanks, with the Taurus, with the Abrams, after so many back and forths with the F-16s, the Storm Shadows, the Atacams, in the end, they always validated the delivery of the weapons in question. Therefore, I'm closer to the yes but decision regarding the delivery of these small-sized Tomahawks. In miniature form, these single Tomahawk launchers are limited and few in number. Even if these missiles were deployed, they would trigger a very, very dangerous escalation. So be careful, very careful with this situation, regardless of how it's resolved with limited Tomahawk missiles, because this still implies an unpredictable danger. Please everyone, give us a thumbs up, it really helps us spread our videos. Adrian Zelaya's program for today will be held tomorrow, so tomorrow is his show, and we'll be back here again with Juan Antonio Aguilar, also tomorrow at 9 p.m. European time, 4 p.m. in the Southern Cone, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Paraguay.
3
in the afternoon, if I remember correctly, in Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. In any case, in our announcements we always include the time correspondences for all countries, all time zones. So don't miss it, because there are many topics to discuss with him tomorrow. Here, and also tomorrow night, Fernando Moragon will be on DMP Geopolitics with his own program, as usual. Please help DMP Geopolitics grow by subscribing to our sister channel. Great analysts there, such as Fernando Moragon himself, Juan Antonio Aguilar, Eduardo Viego, Bruno Garcini, Adrián Zelaya, Santiago Martínez, Javier Martínez, many top-level analysts.
Muchos analistas de recontralujo, no lo desaprovechen. Suscripción al canal de MP Geopolítica bajo el enlace.
Don't miss out. Subscribe to the DMP Geopolitics channel through the link, and for those who wish, help us grow our English language channel, which was launched very recently. Support us by subscribing or by sharing it among your international contacts, so that in some way we can spread this critical perspective on the world and on war in pursuit of a political resolution, for a world that's a bit more humane, a bit fairer, a bit less warlike than the one we have now. Among English speakers, or anyone learning English but who doesn't speak Spanish like we do, in our beloved language. Demoledores and demolidoras, a huge hug, and see you tomorrow.
Abrazo enorme y hasta el día de mañana.